Welcome to What Do You Want to Do, the show that will hopefully help you figure out what you want to do in life or reconnect you to what you love doing. Each show has a guest who is doing what they want to do, whether it's in their career or in addition to their regular job. Most importantly, we want to help you realize that no matter your age, you too can do what you want to do if you have the will to do it. Now here's your host, Leonard Kaplan.
Welcome to What Do You Want to Do? And my special guest tonight is Dan Kline, who was one of my original Cable Club members. Cable Club was an after-school activity that I ran for a cable company up in Swampscott, Mass. And the incredible talent that came out of that studio astounds me from day to day. And Dan, you are no exception. And you are perfect for What Do You Want to Do because you're doing what you want to do. So let's hear the story.
Yeah, I am. And so let's go back to the beginning because I owe all of this to you. And the reason I say that is not just because you happen to be encouraging in the studio. So we had a small public access studio in the high school. I was a junior and I'd kind of sized out of playing sports. I'm not the tallest man. I'm only about 5'8". And I played hockey. And at some point, being really smart was no longer enough to keep me from being really dead when playing hockey against much bigger people. So I was kind of adrift. I didn't know what to do. I'd sort of changed friend groups. I was at that high school age where kids are drinking and doing stuff that I kind of didn't. I'm a big fan of having a nice drink in a bar with my friends. I don't want to stand in a field and swig beer. I never did. So I heard an announcement one day looking to cast somebody to host a movie review television show. And I went down and I met Len and I interviewed with Elaine, who was the producer of the show, and ended up getting the job and pretty quickly learned I liked being on camera. And Len and I did a bunch of things together. We did a comedy show called Week in Review that later became 4 Weeks in Review because we didn't produce them every week. But I learned that I really just liked camera, being on camera, being behind the scenes, editing, telling a story, being able to produce what I wanted to do. So that gave me direction. But that part's great. That part is something that I think Len has done for a lot of people. But for me, I was a smart kid who teachers had mostly given up on because I didn't take well to school. There were very few teachers in Swampscott who understood just that there are smart kids. I now know that I was ADHD and I had trouble focusing if I wasn't super interested. I wasn't disruptive. I sat in class reading books. But the speed of class was always slow for me. And very few teachers took the time. Mr. McLaughlin took the time. Our Spanish teacher, Miss Mitchell, took the time. Our French teacher, Judith Pressler, took the time. These are actually, the exception of Mr. McLaughlin, who's no longer with us, people who I still in some way keep in touch with, because there were many teachers in that school, and most of them just looked at me as why doesn't he try harder? Instead of digging in and figuring out, oh, wait a minute, there's reasons for this. And yeah, I was immature. I figured that out later in life, that sometimes you just have to do things you don't want to do. But being in the studio was really the first time that showed me I could be really, really good at something that was useful, that actually led to a job. So that influenced my decision on where to go to college. I started looking at schools that had video programs. I went up to Syracuse and knew instantly I didn't like it, that I wasn't going to fit in with all the everyone from Newton, Mass who wants to be a sportscaster is pretty much filling up that school. I looked at Emory and really didn't want to be in Boston. So I drove down with my dad. I didn't have my license yet. I am driving his car illegally because I have a permit. You're not allowed to drive out of state. He points me in the right direction and goes to sleep. That is my first highway driving experience. Drove up to Hofstra University on Long Island, which had a television program. And I got into Hofstra, which was baffling because my grades did not deserve to get in anywhere. But I did have really good SAT scores. So that helped. And when I got there, I walked into the TV department on the first week. I wasn't a TV major. I was taking some classes. And I said, wow, I have all these show ideas. When can I, get some editing time? When can I do some stuff? And they said, oh, you're not going to do any of that till you're a junior. And I'm like, but you have a 24-hour campus television station that only has 2 hours of programming. Why aren't you letting, I understand you want to teach me and that's great. I want to learn, but why aren't I experimenting? And what happened was they weren't open to that. So I ended up working first on the humor magazine in college. and then the newspaper. And I fell in love with that way of telling stories. And I ended up being co-editor with my college roommate for 2 years, which is a weird, you're only allowed to be it for one, but a buddy of ours, our junior year, had been elected and he stepped down really early. So we were able to run. So for 2 years, I ran the school newspaper. And I always liked TV. And because I was the editor of the paper, I did a weekly show where I had the university president on. I did a lot of television and radio, but not through the television and radio department. I didn't take a single class in television or radio all through college. And that was really because I knew how to do stuff. This was back in the days of, jog and shuttle editing. I knew that. We'd done some basic green screen stuff. Like we did for a pretty basic studio in Swampscott High School, we did some really impressive things. So it came down to that. I sort of knew I didn't want the bureaucracy. And then once I got some journalism into me, I felt like I wanted to do something newsy in television. But here's the problem, and I'm not disparaging myself when I say this. I have wacky lifestyle reporter looks. I don't have traditional anchorman looks, and I didn't want to be the guy reporting from the cat show. Now on the internet, there's so much opportunity for everybody to do things. But back then, TV jobs were very, very staid, very traditional. And I don't know that I would have enjoyed being a producer. And I also had a little bit of that, and this will come up again later in life. I didn't want to move to Columbia, South Carolina, and then Wilmington, Delaware, and then Austin, Texas. And that was the life of a television person. So I ended up in magazines. And the first place I worked was a trade company. I edited a magazine for, I was working there part-time, and my boss got fired during CES of all things, the Consumer Electronics Show. So I put the magazine together. And when the boss got back, she went, "Do you want a job?" I'm like, "Well, I have 6 months of college left, but as long as we could work around that." So all of my friends didn't have jobs coming out of school. I still had a job. I had a job while in school. And I learned pretty quickly that we had a television studio in our magazine production. And we did, and Len, this is dating me. Back in the old days, at a big trade show like Consumer Electronics Show, there used to be a news tape. Like you'd produce a daily news show, you'd run the VHS tape of it to all the hotels, and it would run on loop in a channel. We produced those. So I was a hand for the first year, just a hand being the producer, but I knew how to ask the questions. But I was 19 years old. I wasn't old enough really to have any sort of gravitas to be on these shows. But they would ask, they'd hand me the cameraman and send me out. And I come back and my boss, who's a big, burly, terrifying man, says to me, "How do you know how to do this?" And I said, "I've been doing it since high school. Like I know how to do this." Like you would send me to go cover like a golf match or like some ridiculous thing in high school. Because I think we had to do one of every sport. So how hard it is to do golf with one camera. Like that's pretty difficult. So we knew that. And then when options came up at some of the smaller shows we did, where my boss would not want to hire professional talent. Usually we had a reporter on scene and like local news anchors at like a desk taping. I would write the show for the news anchors. The reporter, I'd be producing him. And then as I got a little bit older, they started at some of the less shows saying, "Well, do you want to be on camera?" And I got to at trade shows be asking Sony about their new camcorder or whatever it was. And it was all because I already had the time. This is a recurring theme. Put the work in and you're ready when an opportunity comes up. But again, I knew that I didn't want that life. I got offers. I had opportunities to go work at some of the sports networks, and was just afraid of how volatile it is. You're on a show, your show gets canceled, and now you don't have a job. And like that. Yeah. That doesn't play well to me. I think you understand that because you've opted in for, you do what you love, but it's also a steady career. They very rarely cancel school.
Exactly, except in the last year or so.
Yes, we've all become Zoom stars in the last year or so. So, I left trade magazines and I did a brief sprint through the rock magazine world. I worked at Guitar World magazine. I edited the biggest lifestyle publication. It was a free weekly on Long Island, sort of in the vein of the Village Voice. Had some really, really cool jobs. ended up in the early or the late 90s pioneering some really cool websites, uproar.com, which was a top 25 game show site where I got to put Family Feud online. And that sounds like it would be fun. It was. They sent me a big basket of all of the Family Feud surveys from like 1970 on, and I had to pick which ones weren't dated. Because like maybe in 1983, they would say, name something you check every day, and email wasn't a choice because it wasn't a thing. So that was really fun. And I got some producing and some background experience. Went to helped create a men's lifestyle website that was bought by Playboy, which was a terrible, terrible experience. They were an awful company to work for.
No kidding, huh?
Yeah, it's funny. So
Why?
their values were set in the 70s. And we were this really cool young men's lifestyle thing, sort of doing just, like things like, okay, we know that people in their 20s don't know what, say, this cocktail is. So we'll go out on Friday after work and we'll all test it and tell you what it's like. Or we had a column called The Other Team's Playbook, where one of my female friends would say what the women's magazines were saying about men. And like a feature called Pretend You've Read, where we take a book that was really popular, but our guy friends didn't want to read, and we would tell them what the book was about so they could get through a discussion on it. Really groundbreaking, innovative stuff. And at Playboy, in 1999, the corporate credit card was still the Diners Club. And you'd go on a business trip and there'd only be like 3 places you could eat. And you'd come back and they'd be like, why did you have dinner at a steakhouse 4 nights in a row? I'd be like, there was no other choice. Like this. So tons of lawyers, just really, really not fun. Bounced around freelance for a few years, didn't do much in the video space, but sort of always was on the edge of like trying things on the internet back when, like, you remember when it would take like 10 minutes to download a photo. In those days, I'm doing like short form videos that like maybe like 6 people had like an ISDN line and could see, but still sort of keeping my toes in it. Ended up editing newspapers and enjoyed that, but there's no money in it. And so my son is 17. When my son was born, decided I can't be a newspaper editor because that's a 8 a.m. to 2 in the morning kind of job, especially in the days of declining staffs. So I went to work for the family business for 4 years. And my family owns Lynn Ladder and Scaffolding in Lynn, Massachusetts. And I got a lesson in selling and learned the business and really had a good time. But I knew I wasn't going to stay there forever. That was always what do you do as a new parent, when you can't really pursue. So I took a job, as you know, at a very large toy store, a sort of panacea, amazing toy store. And I thought, well, I'll work this job and that'll allow me free up some creative time. I'd already done a book. I had a deal to do a second book. And I didn't realize that retail is all encompassing and you'd have no ability. So after 2 years there, I took my boss aside and I said, I think I got to go. Like, I'm creatively dying here. And he's still a good friend of mine. We worked out sort of like, well, you'll leave, but you'll still be around and I'll use you as a consultant. And so it was kind of like a soft landing to not have a job, which is a terrifying thing. And I wrote my second book, Worst Ideas Ever, which is a really funny book, and it sold reasonably well. But that's when I learned that there is no money in writing books, and that is not a great path to pursue. So did a bunch of different things and ended up out of a job at some point, and I'll accelerate my story a little bit. And a buddy of mine calls up and he says, do you want to work for Microsoft? And my college roommate, to be fair. And I said, yes, I would like to work for Microsoft. That sounds great. Like, and all I'm thinking is, I bet Microsoft pays well. I bet they have health insurance. I didn't realize I was going to become a contractor for Microsoft, but that's fine. I work for a great contracting company, and I do the interview for the job. And I ask, well, this all sounds great, but what's the job? And my future boss says, I can't tell you. And I said, what do you mean you can't tell me? He said, the job is yours if you want it, and you'll be great at it, but I can't tell you until you come out here and sign non-disclosure agreements.
Wow.
So get flown out, and I learn that I am the launch editor of what was to be then known as the Windows 8 Finance app. Later became the MSN Money app, is now terrible because it's curated by robots and not people.
Oh.
But yeah, it's awful. The stories will make no sense. But when I was there, it was a very thoughtful product under Bing. And Bing, because it was based on images, we had photo editors, and I'd work with the photo editor, pick what our beautiful lead image was. So you'd have to find a news story that deserved to be the lead with an image with it that deserved to be the lead. So a lot of my visual training, my television sort of came into it. And while this was happening, I was doing my first podcast. We did our Worst Ideas podcast from the book. And I started getting back into doing that prep. And I stayed at Microsoft for about a year, but after my fourth boss was fired, it seemed like, everything was great until the product launched. And then once it launched, Windows 8 didn't do well.
Right.
So there was a lot of blame and excuse making. And, just when I was the one guy in the project who wasn't in Bellevue, Washington. So every time there was a new boss, I'd have to go to the Herculean attempt of standing out. And I was just exhausted by it because the last boss I had really, really liked me, was trying to make me a full-time employee rather than a contractor, had flown me out there to do that. And I'm literally in HR going over stuff when I get called back by him to learn that he was fired.
Now, where was this that you had to go to?
Bellevue, Washington. So right outside of Seattle. We're a lot.
State. Okay.
Yeah, which is great. I love the area. At the time, we'd really thought about, maybe we'd move out there because it's kind of hard to have a long career at Microsoft if you don't live in that area. It's very expensive. There's a lot of traffic, but my wife works in nonprofits. There's a lot of nonprofits out. It made sense, but that wasn't to be. So at that point, I just started looking. And for I want to say 15th time in my life, I applied for my childhood dream job. I applied to work at the Boston Globe. And I got what I later learned was a courtesy interview. They had already decided who was going to get the job. They hadn't seen enough people, so they brought me in. And I'm a big preparation guy. If I have an interview, I always look at it like the NFL assistant coaches who they always get the job if they've planned every aspect of what it would look like if they were the head coach. So I walked into my first day interview and I had a PowerPoint on my 100-day plan. The job was a senior producer for the Boston.com business section, which doesn't exist anymore. And I walked in and I said, I think I had 7 more interviews until they finally offered me the job. And there I was producing content. I wrote for the paper. I was able to do videos. Like there was a production studio there. And if you booked time, you could do anything you wanted because it doesn't cost any money. And then I walked in, they at the time had a radio station, and the radio station played music, but I think Henry Santoro from WFNX, which is no longer, but WFNX was the alternative music station in Lynn, Mass. And Henry was the news director, and he was one of my heroes because it was the music I liked as a kid and music I like now. I walked in to introduce myself to Henry, who was the morning host and the news director. And I just sheepishly told him I was a fan, that I'd won tickets from him, back when I was in high school and things like that. And I said, but I notice you always have people on from the news section. Why don't you have anybody from the business section on? Right. And he said, none of them want to do it. And I said, I'll do it. So every day I'd pitch Henry in the morning, hey, here are some business stories. And he didn't put me on every day, but maybe 3-4 days a week. And then it started being, if it was a day where maybe something big had happened, maybe Apple had done something, I might end up on 3 or 4 shows in the day, doing anywhere from a 2-minute drop-in to being around for half an hour. So again, it was working with amazing professional broadcasters, Julie Kramer, Adam 12, people who are Boston mainstays, who are, again, friends of mine now, but then people that I, absolutely admired. And all of a sudden I got back into having that practice. The problem is, on my first day at the Boston Globe, before I'd been issued a computer, we got called into an all-hands meeting, and the New York Times announced that they were putting the paper up for sale. So on my first day, I don't even have an ID badge yet. My boss tells me I should probably start looking for a job because it's a union shop and it's first in, first out. So I'm living in essentially Hartford, Connecticut, commuting 2.5 hours. My mother does live in Salem, so I could stay with my mother some nights. But we can't move because I don't know if I have a job. Right. So I commute back and forth to, for almost 10 months, end up taking a job back, running a couple of newspapers in Connecticut. And at that point, I knew I wanted to be in finance. I knew I wanted to be doing something in the business journalism world, but I didn't know what the paths to that were. So I'm editing these 2 local, small, like the Lynn Item kind of newspapers. And I get an email from a buddy of mine. I'd done some free writing for a website that a friend of mine owned. And he says, hey, I'm doing some work at Motley Fool. Would you be interested? And at the time, I'm not making any money. I'm editing 2 newspapers. I have a 7-year-old, whatever it is, at home. So I start doing a few stories for a new section at the Motley Fool, which is a stock advice service mostly, but they'd sort of branched out into business. And my first story is accepted. And I think, I got this down. My first story, my next 4 stories were rejected. And thankfully, the person who was my boss there, a good friend of mine named Roger Friedman, he understood that I knew what I was doing. I just had to make the jump from analyst, from reporter to analyst, to have a little bit of myself in the story. So he gave me detailed feedback and I figured it out and I became a regular, and I was about to get promoted to contractor. That's sort of when you're like officially part of the team. You can do things without editor's permission. There's a lot of lists of story ideas. It's basically an unlimited earning potential once you get through that door. And that's about to happen. And all of a sudden, 70% of our traffic in those days came from Yahoo, and Yahoo kicked us out. So all the editors go into a meeting. Every person who's not a contractor except me gets let go. I get invited to go to, they have an annual writers conference. And if you're a contractor, they fly you out, they pay for your hotel room. I got invited, but they didn't pay for anything. I walk into a room where Roger, my boss, is no longer on the editorial team. He'd moved elsewhere in the company. I know one person in the room. And thankfully, one of the editors there who knew my work took me aside and said, we know we need you. We just don't know what that looks like. Give us some time. And it took a couple of months of every story I sent in, they'd send back and say, there's not enough stock market in this. And I'd write back and say, I'm not the stock market guy. And eventually that I became a regular, a real popular writer there. And originally their podcast had been done as 2 editors would team up and do like one of the podcasts. One of the editors was sick or out or wasn't available. And one of my editors called me up and said, hey, can you jump on the podcast today? And, as we talked about with preparation, I could, and I was ready. I knew how to do it. So the second I did one, they went, ooh, will you be part of like the regular fill-in rotation? Yes, of course. Then they decided, why don't we do the podcast as one in-house person with a rotating cast of outside people? So then instead of just doing like one every couple of weeks, I might be doing 2 or 3 a week across their different shows. And then even better luck, maybe about 3 years ago, their signature show is called Market Foolery. It's it's one of the top 2% of all business podcasts out there, hosted by a true pro named Chris Hill. And I'm visiting the office in Alexandria, and I would fly down once a month, whether it's at their expense or mine, because getting FaceTime was valuable. Like seeing your editors, being in the studio instead of being remote, I found that valuable. And it brought up, so I'm in the office and there's about a ½ inch of snow in Alexandria. Now, you know where I'm from, a ½ inch of snow. They don't cancel school. They don't do anything. I get to the office. There's no one there to let me in. Everybody's kids are home from school. Alexandria doesn't handle snow. Yeah. So my boss comes in just to visit for a little bit, let my colleague and I in. And I get a Slack message from Chris Hill, who I know I've sat in on shows he's done. I've never been on a show and he says, oh, do you want to do Market Foolery today? And I said, is it because I'm the only person in the building? And he said, oh, no. I was going to have you on anyway. And I said, I don't think that's true, but yes, I'd love to do it. And I did it, and our chemistry was great. And all of a sudden, whenever I visited, I would email Chris and I'd say, hey, I'm going to be in the office Monday and Tuesday. And he would say, oh, great, you'll do Tuesday show. And once a month, pretty regularly, I would do that. And sometimes I would do a couple episodes of Industry Focus a week, or Motley Fool Answers, or David Gardner's Rule Breakers. And just that was becoming more and more of my job, was broadcasting. So then the pandemic hits. So I'm getting us up to the current time here. Mm-hmm. The pandemic hits and they start doing more video. I don't know about this because no one has clued me in on it. And one of my former bosses says, hey, we want to do a 2-hour-long show for just everybody, not behind the paywall. And would you be interested in being on? And I said, sure. And I should probably host. And he said, oh, okay. Like if you want to, like, we're going to have someone host the first hour and you can host the second hour. And the person who hosted the first hour, who was a good friend of mine, he wasn't that great. He's actually really good now, but he hadn't done it before. He knew his stuff. And then I got on the second hour and I knew how to host. I knew how to bring people in who weren't good broadcasters. I knew how to take questions. I knew how to keep it moving. And it went really well and everyone was really excited. And then nothing happened. And then a few weeks later, I learned that they didn't want to do public facing stuff. They wanted to do what's now called full TV, which is 9 a.m. to sometimes 6 p.m. At the beginning, 9 a.m. to midnight of just live television-like shows for members. When it started, it was much more like talk radio, very free form. A couple of months in, I started writing show formats, but they start this up and no one asked me to be a part of it. So I'm not shy. I know the people behind it, all who outrank me by a ton, but some of whom are friends. And I just said, why are you doing this without asking me? And very begrudgingly, they said, oh, okay, like there's an hour free. It was like Wednesday at 8 o'clock or like some, god awful, nobody's watching time. And, do what you want with it. So I prepared a show. I had a rundown. I had a format. I invited other people on and the bosses watched it. And the bosses said, essentially, would you mind just doing this now? So for the first 7 months of the pandemic, I was broadcasting 3 to 5 hours a day, doing everything from interviewing a celebrity to at 4 o'clock every day. I did a show that was formatted very much like Pardon the Interruption on ESPN, that had live voting on Zoom and had really become very connected and very personal with the audience. But because it was members only, that limited, and I can't share how many members. They have many, many members, but only some percentage of those members watch the show. But the people who are watching, it became like, like a late night radio show when the host and the audience have that connection. Sure. These became the people in my world in a time where we were not truly in lockdown because I live in Florida and there are no rules here, but where we weren't going out much, and when I say going out much, I mean going to the grocery store when we had to in a mask because we couldn't get an Instacart, delivery in the early days of it. We were being very, very careful. So this became, my colleagues who I broadcast with in the audience, but I really wanted to do something public facing. So as you can see, I'm wearing a 7 Investing shirt. I'm sitting in front of a 7 Investing banner. And right before the pandemic, Simon Erickson, the CEO of 7 Investing, who was a portfolio manager at Motley Fool, which is how I knew him, he came to me and said, I want to do something different. I want to do something smaller, a little more personal. Fool's really, really big. So it's hard to, to be personal in your service. And he laid out this idea and I went, well, how are you going to pay for that? Like, do you have like a backer? And he said, well, I've got some money and I'm going to self-fund it. And I went, it's a great idea. And I love the people you've built, but I finally got the job I always wanted. I'm broadcasting. And he's like, but I know you're exhausted. I know, when I wasn't on air, I couldn't talk because my voice was so stressed out from working 6 days a week. I was doing 4 hours most Saturdays. So he kept every month, he'd call me and he'd check in and he'd say, are you ready yet? I really want you to host our show. I really want you to build your vision public facing. And then at some point, and Motley Fool is the greatest place on earth. I have nothing bad to say about it. At some point, I just got the itch to do something different. And I don't know if that was pandemic wanderlust, if it was the limitations of not living where the office was. And that does sort of mean there's only so far you can go. All my friends are there. The management, they're a wonderful place. I've sent many people to go work there or to apply there since I left. But I called Simon up and I said, yeah, I'm in. And he said, well, what are you thinking for a show? And I said, well, I really wanted to do a formatted but free-flowing live show. And I don't want to record it. I want to do it live. I want there to be warts. I want people to understand that I'm a broadcaster, but you guys aren't. And you're experts and I'll make you look good. And that took a while to build the chemistry. And, it's much harder to interact like this than it is in a studio. In a studio, I can give you some pretty subtle clues. Hey, stop talking. I need to introduce, even, sometimes the host, just that little you did there, turns the camera back to you for a few seconds, breaks it up for the audience. Those little things, are important. Those take time to build when you're doing everything remotely. And we'll always do everything remotely. We're a remote team. But all of a sudden, I went from doing a show that was watched by a couple thousand people, who are members a day, and I'm trying careful to not divulge any secrets here, to doing something public that we might do an episode and 20, 30,000 people might watch half of it. So all of a sudden, the message we're bringing of long-term investing and, sort of being a hand to hold during these scary economic times, a lot more people get to see it. And that's very much the Motley Fool's mission as well. But because we were catering to the public and not just our members, we do lots of video and things for our members as well. All of a sudden, I could do a show that you could watch, that my old friend Chris Morley watches the show because he's in a position where he wants to learn about investing a lot. Every now and then I'll tune in. I'll be like, oh, I went to high school with that person and now they're watching the show. And when it really hit me is we'd been there for 2 or 3 months and we're on air. And someone asked us, and I take a lot of live questions, what did you dream of doing when you were in high school? And everybody gave their answer, and it wasn't necessarily what they were doing. And I said, I dreamed of hosting a television show, and I think I do that now. And I almost started to cry. It was very impactful. And is it the road I thought? Nobody takes this road to doing this. And I'll go to something, our mutual friend, Jamie Denbo, who is actress, writer, producer. She does everything. She's brilliant. And we worked on an idea for a book about her. The problem is she didn't do enough salacious things to get, she had, in my opinion, an incredibly interesting story that's really, really funny about how she came up, but it was a very PG origin story for an actress, and we had trouble getting a lot of interest in it. But one of the things she told me is that when she started acting, she knew that she would have been happy teaching acting or working in regional theater as long as she could eat and have health insurance and the things that she was never set on being a big celebrity. Mm-hmm. And sure, I love when I'm on a cruise ship and someone is treats me like I'm LeBron James. I can't believe I'm on the same cruise ship as them. But that's not the part I like. I like making the show. It feels a lot like when we were sitting in the studio in Swampscott and we would come up with some ridiculous idea and then 2 minutes later be taping it. Like if I'm watching, some business show or checking CNBC and I see, oh my God, something happened and people are going to be worried about that. I could jump right on live and do 10 minutes talking about it. And having the freedom to do that and to sort of be able to, have planned shows that with formats and scripts and all of that, but also just do what's needed when it's needed or experiment. That to me, look, it's hard. I did lots of experimentation on Fool Live, but you also have to remember you're representing a very large brand and there's quite a bit at stake. It's a little more forgiving with a smaller brand. And I've talked too much, so I'm sure you have questions.
Well, I do have questions. You haven't talked too much. You are a dream interviewee because you make the best work. The theme that I'm getting through all of this, now a lot of the story, some of it I knew, but I didn't know the circuitous path that it took you to get where you are today, especially the college part, because we kind of, you were busy and I had new kids and all that stuff. But I remember one conversation that you and I kept having is reviving the comedy show, It's
something I'd still like to do, honestly.
I love that show as well. But the theme is you have, and you've always had confidence ever since I've known you, ever since you were really young. And that, to me, is the mark of anybody's success. Because lack of confidence, insecurity, self-doubt, things like that I think they're the number one things that hold people back from doing what they want to do, as the title says.
So I do have insecurity. And I don't know if this happens to you. In the 3 minutes before any show, when I'm sitting there under, you can't tell, but I'm sitting under 3 studio lights, it's hot, in that moment, sometimes I think, oh my God, how am I going to get through an hour? And I understand it makes no sense because I've done 4 hours straight with no commercials and no breaks, but I'll have that. But in the belief of, can I do this? I've always fully believed that if it's not a job like brain surgeon or crane operator, that most things, if you put me in the room, I can do it. And when it's something I've done, like, they asked me after I did my first show on Fool Live, they said, how do you know how to do this? I said, because I've done it my whole life. Like this isn't,
Right.
even when I was broadcasting to no one, I was still doing it. And when the pandemic started, and today is the anniversary of me doing this, the first thing I did was launched a podcast called I'm Bored. And the idea was, I wasn't going to promote it. I wasn't going to do anything with it. It was going to be a way to talk to my friends and have fun conversations. And we put it out there, and if people liked it, they liked it. And I made a logo, and some of them worked really well. I did a couple with my worst ideas ever co-author, and we know each other really well. And we went through like the worst movies from the 80s. And we did one on breakfast cereal that I've actually listened to multiple times, but I don't usually listen to myself, but like and all of a sudden it was like, oh yeah, I'm doing this. And in the back of my head is, well, how do I make this big? How do I make it a thing? But it was just sort of this belief that if you do something well and you put yourself out there, eventually they're going to notice. And I go back to like my Boston Globe hiring story. For many years, we lived in the greater Hartford area, and Hartford Business Journal would advertise for its editor. They needed an editor every 2 or 3 years. And the first time I applied, they ignored me. I was like, I'm a journalist. I have all this journalism experience. I could totally learn business. I know the area. Ignored me. The second time I had a little bit of business experience, and I applied, and the woman wrote back and she said, yeah, I remember you, but I wish you would have a little more direct experience. Well, the job came up when I worked in Boston at the Globe in the business section, and it ended up not working out for financial reasons, but I was offered the job, and it was a situation where, I said to the person, like, it's too bad you didn't take a chance on me when I first started, because I always could do the job. And, I am confident like that. But with broadcasting, how many hours of experience did I get as a high school junior and senior? I mean, we would make shows, that no one would see. Like, we would do interview shows that were just practice. And, I'm not sure if anyone ever watched my interview with the middle school principal, but, there were some fun experiences. And even in college, I took a circuitous path where I ended up on the TV station because I was famous as the editor of the newspaper. And one of the things I did as the editor of the newspaper is every week after the paper came out, I went to the president's office, and Mike DeLuise, the head of PR at Hofstra, would sit me down and tell me what he thought I did wrong. And it wasn't in a chiding way. He's still a mentor and a friend. It was in a learning experience way. And
instructive.
And sometimes he would say, oh, you really got us there. And some days he would be like, Dr. Stewart, that was our departed, he's no longer with us, president, but a wonderful man. He'd be like, Dr. Stewart's pretty mad at that editorial. Like, he does not like what you'd have to say. and I would say, like, well, does he want to come on a show and talk to me about it? And he would. So
the thing is, you're not afraid to speak your mind. You're not afraid of what might happen later. You just do what you do in good faith. And that's all anybody should be required to do. I think fear is a paralyzing thing, and fear of consequences and stuff like that. It stops innovation.
I try very hard to be intellectually honest. I think there's a lot of people in the financial advice space. I mean, look, if I wanted to be one of those yelling idiots on CNBC, I could come up with a hot take that would do that. Yeah. But we believe in long-term investing. So I can't tell you, do this now, because it doesn't matter. But buy Amazon, hold it for a long time. That's not rocket science. It's also not that exciting. But, I sort of chose that if I was going to go on and give you an opinion on something, that it's going to be my actual opinion. And if that opinion changes, I'm going to tell you about it. One of my picks, and we don't disclose our stock picks publicly, that's what the members get, but one of my stock picks was a stock I, for almost a year on Motley Fool Live, was pretty negative on. And we do a video call where we pitch our colleagues on what our pick is going to be that month. And I said, here's how I viewed that company, and here's why I was wrong. And here's how I learned during the pandemic how wrong I was. It's important to be honest. I think it's also important to fail. Live television, things are going to go badly sometimes. I was doing a live trivia show called Fool Me Once, which was a delight. It was almost fully scripted. Our banter wasn't scripted, but the questions and everything was scripted. And what the points we were going to get in while people were voting, on the answer to the question was bullet pointed. And with 3 minutes left to go, power went out in my building and I just disappeared. And thankfully, my colleague who was on with me is a pro and he could get through it. Not everyone would have been able to do that, but like that happens. You've done Zoom calls where people just disappear, or so I'm not
every day.
I'm not worried about looking stupid. I'm not worried about saying something wrong if it's unintentionally wrong. You can always correct something, or I am famous for, knowing almost the number. I'll be like, it was like 2.85 billion, something around there. Like, I'm not a big memorizer of numbers because I don't think it matters all that much in my world. But yeah, you have to be confident and you have to be ready when the opportunity comes. If you're a young kid, and I before the pandemic, I was doing not a fair amount, but a couple of, speaking to college journalist groups, and all of them wanted to be some version of what I was, but they didn't want to do the work. One kid said, well, I want to do like a travel, I want to make a living as a travel writer. And I said, well, if you really want to do that, you identify what city you're going to go to. And then you find the 500 publications that might be interested. So you go to Bowling World magazine and you say, okay, I'm going to be in Salem, Mass. Would you want something on candlepin bowling? And he's like, but I don't care about candlepin bowling. I said, it doesn't matter. You need to fund your trip to Salem, Mass to write the couple of pieces you want. And none of them really took that to heart. And I had a million failed websites and shows and who knows what that I tried to do. And you learn from that. And you have to put that work in.
Well, people sometimes, I get students all the time, freshmen come in, and a lot of them don't have the right idea when it comes to the work that goes in behind the scenes. They just know what they see. Oh, that's entertaining. But when they see sometimes how editing is, how just shooting cutaways. I'm spending like weeks trying to get people to shoot cutaways the right way. B-roll, folks, if you're into this. And they'll go in a room after an interview, take a couple of long shots. Oh, we're ready to go. I go, no, you're going to be here for the whole hour of this class. And that's what you got to do. And they look at me funny, like, what? They don't realize that for every minute of TV that you see, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, stuff is on the cutting room floor, as they say.
It was really tough to explain to my non-broadcasting colleagues. So, some of my bosses at Motley Fool were also podcast hosts or people who at least had done that at some point. And when we first started as contractors, we got paid for being on air, not for prep. And when I did a Motley Fool podcast, I got paid significantly more because it encompassed prep, because the person who set that pay structure understood what you have to do before the show.
Yeah.
So my bosses would say things like, oh, you're such a natural. Like, how do you know all that stuff? I'm like, I have a 30-page script in front of me. Like I put it all on a piece of paper and I studied it so I would know where it was if it came up. I'm like, you're seeing a finished product. I said, hey, it's awesome when you ask me to like do an hour on Costco when I know the company inside out and I don't have to do any work. Like, that's great. But like, what happens when you ask me to do an hour on Tractor Supply, which I'd never heard of when they asked me to do it? So like there's a lot, or an interview. I interviewed John Hope Bryant, who is just an amazing, figure in the nonprofit world. And I'd never met him. I didn't know his name before I had him on, or I had the then CEO of TiVo on. And admittedly, my first question to him is, there's still a TiVo? I cleared it with him beforehand. I wasn't going to waylay him with that, because that was kind of the story we were telling. But I had to go in and learn this company to fill an hour. And Len, you've interviewed people. You don't know if they don't have a body of interviews, if they're a talker, or I've had people on that are really good, but their answers are succinct.
Right.
And when you're doing a show that fills a slot, like a radio slot, you have to fill the time. So you have to be prepared to get through, but all of the work leading up to it, whether that was stuff in the studio or my days of doing trade show, where I was literally reporting the news, bringing it back to someone, sitting while someone edited. I couldn't touch the editing stuff for union reasons in Vegas, but I'd be behind the person. And then I would often be the person taking a cab to the different hotels, dropping those tapes off. you learn, you understand every bit of what the work is. And I will say it is joyous now that some of that work technology has made a lot easier. I
Right.
miss editing the old way, but I do
Yeah.
appreciate how nice it is to do. And I don't have to do a lot of editing because I do a live show,
Mhm.
but there is just a lot. Like I'm sitting in front of a real background, but I have a
Mhm.
green screen behind me.
Right.
I can put it up and have a studio quality whatever, which
Right.
is, just unheard of back when.
This is my fake green screen, by the way.
Yeah,
I have a real. You can tell.
you can tell.
I have a real one in the other room, and I can't close it. I don't know how to put it away. So
so,
it's supposed to be one of those canvas ones, and it goes boom.
so,
But
so,
the day I opened it, I never could close it again, and I don't feel like lugging it around.
so
But
the
go
reason
ahead.
I'm not using mine is
Yeah.
I have like an easel one, but that's in the office space. I
Ah.
still have for a few more months, which I was using before we moved. And the one I have here, it clips on to this thing behind me. But the clips, I bought like vice clips, and it sometimes falls. So there's nothing worse, like, which is fine if I'm taping a 2-minute thing and I want my background to be, the new Rise of the Resistance ride at
Right.
Hollywood Studios. It is not great if you're doing an interview and all of a sudden your background falls apart. So
That's not good. Now, you're a family man,
I am.
and through all of these versions of your career that you've been through, your family has been there. Now, you, to me, what you do, changing jobs and leaving giant companies for little ones is something a single guy would do. You know what I
So
mean? What does your wife think about all this stuff?
so it's important to note that I was at Motley Fool for 6 years. So
Okay.
so I did have a period of stability.
Yeah, I don't mean to say you're reckless.
No. Here's the thing. So I've been married for 20 years. I met my
Uh-huh.
wife as a freshman in the Chronicle newsroom at Hofstra. So,
Okay.
we dated for all of college, broke up for a little bit because, you need to sort of make sure you're making the right choice.
Uh-huh.
And I will say my wife has always just had faith that things will work out for me. And it's funny. There are times that I don't like that, where it's
Mhm.
I sort of want her to recognize, like, well, they don't just work out for me. Like I network,
Right.
I put in the time, it's not just like I'm stumbling into one good job after the other.
Well, it appears not that way, but it appears not to be too hard for you. That's how you've
It's
always
Yeah, and here's
appeared.
the thing, it's not,
You project
because
it.
any job I've ever interviewed for that I wanted, I've been offered. And part of that is I interview well. Part of it is I think interviewing's not taught. So
Mhm.
like if I go interview someplace, I've read everything there is to read about the company. I know my boss's boss's
Mm.
boss and what's thing, I don't think a lot of people do that. Like as
No.
someone who hired at newspapers and was offering hiring kids straight out of college, first question I would ask is like, why don't you have more clips from your college paper? And there's only one acceptable answer to that. The answer is I had to work to pay for school. If
Right.
that's not your answer, then you don't want to do this for a living. Because if you wouldn't do it for free, you're not going to do it for $22,000 a year or whatever terrible money it pays to be an entry level small time reporter.
In my non-professional opinion, you couldn't possibly have ADHD because with all this research, it's boring. It's
It's
tedious.
no,
It's
no, it's
long
no,
hours.
it's not. So that's the difference. And I learned it first in the studio in Swampscott. So I was always a reader.
Yeah.
And I never thought much of it. But the second I found the studio, and I see a lot of this in my son too, who's not a great student, but can become very involved. I used to sneak into the studio so I could edit to all hours of the night.
Mhm.
Once I found something I was into,
Yeah.
no amount of work deterred me. So yeah, are there days where I wake up and it's like, ugh, I have to read through the earnings call transcript of these 3 companies today? Sure, that's not a joy always. But if I know the end product is a better show or a better written article, I
Yeah, I get you.
I have some tactics too now. Like I wish somebody had told me in high school, do the thing you least want to do first. And
Mhm.
like, cause I start my day and I start at 7 most days. I work on
Mhm.
my couch until I come down to the studio.
Mhm.
My son gets up at 6 to get on the bus at about 6:25.
Mhm.
So I'm up pretty early, and whatever it is I don't want to do, unless I have something that's time, like if I have to prepare a document for someone else on the show, well, I'll do that first, even though I enjoy it. But usually the thing I do first is what I don't want to do. If I had done that in high school, I would have had an easier path. I was definitely really good at creating roadblocks for myself. And I'd say that was true of my professional career as well. I would work places when I was younger, and I wasn't all that respectful of the wait in line idea. I always had the, but I'm good at this. Let me do this thing now. And you need a special kind of boss to acknowledge that, or you need to be someplace where other people, like, part of the reason I got to do a lot of TV stuff at my first job is because none of the other editors wanted to go stay in Fleabag hotels. You know, we were not a wealthy company, or at least they weren't putting a lot of money into where I was staying, you know, and eat badly and work 19 hours a day. Not a lot of people wanted to do that. So nobody was jealous of me getting to be that guy. At other places, maybe I did get frustrated and leave before I should have, because things weren't happening quick enough. And what was interesting about sort of how it came together at Motley Fool is, in the beginning, when you're a writer, all you want to do is be a good enough writer that you make a decent living. Then you realize you can make a good living. Most writers there don't get invited into the inside of the company and see, but I was lucky that when I moved to Florida, I had pitched my then boss, who's a dear friend of mine now, on, hey, I used to work at Microsoft. We're partnered with Microsoft. Can I get them to feature our articles more? And he said, yeah, I'll kick you $500 a month to figure that out. And all of a sudden, I took something that was nothing and made it into a very, very lucrative deal, where it sort of upped our weight class, where we'd point out we had good stuff every day. They'd agree it would be on the front page. And all of a sudden, so then I started doing more partnership stuff. And that gave me the opportunity to go to the office. And when I went to the office, I went, wait, there's all these other areas where you do use some contractors and I could work my way in. That's sort of how, you know, I started to see the bigger world. But that's also a two-edged sword, because once you see all the opportunities you don't have, you start to go like, well, why don't I have that? Like, whereas when I was just a writer, I was very, very happy with the fact that I was making a good living writing. You know, that's not something a lot of people could say.
No, it isn't. Not at all. Now, as far as the people who join Seven Investing, it's all ages, or is it a certain age group?
So we try hard to be something for everybody. So Seven Investing is, at core, our core product is 7 stock picks. Each member of our team makes a stock pick each month. And these are long-term investments. And we produce a report on it written, and a video pitch where we pitch our colleagues and they can ask questions. So you get a lot of information. But then we also tell you, like, I'm 47 years old. Some of my colleagues are in their 20s. Some are in their 30s. I have one child who's almost college age. Some of them have young children. We try to tell you our personal story and our investing styles. I'm pretty conservative compared to my colleagues. I'm not generally picking the latest new technology thing or biotech that could go bust. I joke, I call my stocks elephant up a hill stocks. They're pushing the thing up a hill. They're going to get there. The chart's going to look good over 10 years. It's not necessarily going to look good tomorrow. And we try to be really inviting. I don't know this in any sort of scientific way, but I would argue that we're the financial service that has the most female members, because we try to be approachable. We don't use a lot of jargon. We're not a boys club. We're not. I want to be for everybody. There are no dumb questions. If someone's never invested before, they might ask, well, what's a this, what's a that? And we're going to take the time to do that. Like, for our members, we do a new member call every month where it's just, how do you use the service? And people will ask things like, well, where do I buy stocks? Excuse me. And we'll say, you know, list out some of the places you could. We try to make it something that if you're a seasoned investor, you're going to get really good stuff from us. But I think our core audience is probably people somewhere between 20 and 60 that want to be in the stock market, don't know what it means. You know, we saw all this craziness with people buying GameStop and other really terrible ideas. We try to be sort of the voice of sanity and saying, like, no, you buy companies with good fundamentals. You don't buy companies because they're a meme. You don't buy companies as a screw you to hedge funds. You really, and I tell people, start with what you know. So, you know, Len, we could tell you're sitting in front of Epcot Center, you're a Disney fan. If you wanted to get into stocks and you said, well, I like Disney, I bet a lot of people like Disney, you would go, yeah, a lot of people like Disney. And you'd read everything and go, ooh, this is a pretty interesting company. And Disney Plus is growing really, really fast. And okay,
Mm,
the theme parks are hurting right now, but do you honestly believe that a year from now, the Disney theme parks, which are best in class, won't be at the top of their game when
sure.
there's a pandemic? So I tell people to start that way. Look around you. I have an iPhone. I wear an Apple Watch. You know
Hmm.
what's a good company? Apple. Like it's but then
Yeah.
you might look and say, okay, I have an LG TV. I don't think LG is publicly traded, but you
Yeah.
might look them up and be like, oh, the economics of TV making aren't that great.
Mm,
Not every company you use is necessarily going to be a great company, but we, of course, do a lot of that work for you. But we also want people who are our members, if they want to learn how to research companies or how to have more conviction about what we're telling them, we talk about our process and how we research things. And it's different for all of us. For me, I own very, very little that I haven't experienced. Like, the vast majority of my personal portfolio is
mhm.
companies that I have an intimate relationship with. Now,
Sure.
I also buy a little bit of the two biotech people on our team. What they recommend every month, I make a very small, like $100 bet on
Mm-hmm.
each month because they're experts. I don't know their space, and
Right.
those things have an enormous potential, and it's 5% of my portfolio. So we try to make investing fun. This is rare in the corporate world. We all like each other.
Right.
My boss built a team of people who either were friends or he knew would fit in well.
That's the
And
best.
I delight in coming to work. I did at Motley Fool too.
Yeah.
I'm traveling next week with my closest friend who's still at Motley Fool and is a big deal there. The
Hmm.
first thing I'm going to do when the pandemic ends is go to Alexandria and buy a thank you dinner for a lot of
Right.
people.
Right.
But that being said, for anyone who's starting out and looking at, if you love the people you work with, you can
Mm.
get through some bad jobs. I used to edit something called Band and Orchestra magazine. I don't know anything about band and orchestra, but I liked my team. I liked my coworkers. I liked the
Hmm.
sales guy I got to travel with. Got me through a year of I don't care about this subject matter. Um,
Right.
and now that I do care about the subject matter and the audience, to get to help people have a better life,
Mm.
to get to take, a 25-year-old Len Kaplan who has $50 extra a month to invest and show them how to do that well and how
Mm.
compounding works and how when the market was down 12% a year ago Tuesday, to be able
Yeah.
to show them historically this happens. Markets drop by 20%, 50%. Microsoft has been down 80% at various points, and it's always stronger. Things recover. We always say
Yeah.
time is the one advantage you have as a long-term investor.
Yeah. But not as an older investor.
No, as an older investor, I would certainly suggest, safety, but safety within reason.
Yeah.
Really strong companies that pay a dividend that don't have much downside. Microsoft and Costco and Apple aren't going to collapse. They're also probably not going to triple in the next 3 years, but they
Sure.
should grow and they pay you a dividend. So there's strategies for all ages.
That's great. That's great. Now we're going to go back to the beginning, even though this is almost the end. Your parents must have had something to do with the way your attitude has been that has got you through all of these changes cheerfully and running head on into it. How did they what was their philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, they always had faith in me, and certainly I'll
Mhm.
say the same thing of my wife. I think my mother, who's a more avid fan of what I do and keeps more involved than my father does, um, probably in the early years wished I'd followed a more traditional path. I think,
Mhm.
back, when they were kids, you got a job at GE and you worked at GE for 30 years and you retired with a pension.
Yeah.
And that kind of wasn't the life I ever envisioned. And I
Right.
think they were at least glad that I didn't pursue being like a radio talk show host or something where I lived
Mhm.
someplace different every 6 months.
Right.
But I also think my parents, I never asked them for money. And,
Mhm.
they had it. And I'm not saying they're not generous. They were very generous, but I never went to them and said, I can't pay my rent this month. Like I always found a way to make a living, even when it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. So, they were scared at times. I think my dad was maybe a little more oblivious to it than my mom. Certainly, she was worried, but you could say the same of my brother. And you don't know my brother Todd all that well. You've met a little bit.
Sure.
Todd started on Monday as the chief commercial officer for Tottenham, a Premier League soccer team. So,
Oh, huh.
basically a global job that's one of the better jobs in the world. So, and he spent 2 years touring with Clifford the Big Red Dog, doing local media buys. So, it has not been an easy road, and I'm glad, because I think if it, when my first book, 50 Things Every Guy Should Know How to Do, came out, which was a
Hmm.
penguin plume book, I got a really big advance for doing it compared to what
Hmm.
advances look like now. And for a very brief time, it seemed like two different television show concepts were going to be sold from the book. The
Wow.
producer of one of the producers of My Name is Earl, if you remember that show,
Yeah.
pretty successful sitcom with Jason Lee, a show I liked a lot, wanted to pay me to write an adaptation, a sitcom adaptation of which made no sense. This was a nonfiction book, but more close is one of the reality companies wanted to adapt it, and they had a really good concept, and I had a contract on paper, and it wasn't a lot of money. It was $1,000, and I didn't have to do anything, but it was $1,000 an episode, with some minor residuals. But we had packaged it with a producer friend, and he'd helped us do all the work to package it, and they didn't want him. So at that point, I couldn't
Oh,
make the deal in good faith. And again,
that's
if that
honorable.
but if that had happened and it had been successful, and maybe it led to a career in doing that, maybe it would have been too easy, and I wouldn't have appreciated. I appreciate every damn person who watches, because I know how hard it is to get people
Yeah.
to watch a television show.
It's amazing. Amazing. Well, you've had an amazing career. I can't wait to see what you do 10 years from now, where you'll be somewhere
I,
different, or maybe
I,
you'll
I,
take over Seven Investing.
Well, we're a partnership, so
Yeah.
we have a founder and a CEO, but we are
Hmm.
largely equals. And my hope really is that it builds, so my next opportunity is within my current opportunity. I do have some places I'd like to host things that that would be more side gigs that
Hmm.
are, I don't want to say I know I'm on the radar, but I know I'm at least in the thought, and the pandemic has made things
Right.
different. So there's definitely some stuff I'd like to do,
Yeah.
but if we could keep growing the company and being part of, like, literally, I help people save money and make
Yeah.
good financial choices. Like, that's awesome. I bump into
Yeah.
people that'll say, like, I saw you at a Motley Fool thing 3 years ago, and that's why I invest now. Like, that to me,
That's great.
it's
That's,
good work. And if
yeah.
I get to do it while also being entertaining, and and telling some bad jokes and occasionally some good ones, like that, yeah, I couldn't be more happy about it.
Well, Dan Kline, thank you for joining me on What Do You Want to Do? As I said, you're a great example of getting to do what you want to do, and you did it with confidence, and you're still on your journey. You're challenging yourself, and you're building your audience year by year in all these different incarnations. And you out there, what do you want to do?